welcome to the International Spy Museum. I'm Peter Ernest, the director. It's great to see you all here for the last in our series of traitors, leakers, and whistleblowers. This, of course, is the icing on the cake as we head for our last session on Snowden. If I would ask you as a matter of courtesy to the speaker, if you'd turn off your cell phones, any other electronic devices. As we head into this last session, and I have told the speaker that when Snowden's name has come up, which has been every time the speaker has been up here, I notice some members of the audience become visibly agitated, so be prepared for that. There's some strong feelings one way or the other. So as we start, by the way, we have our latest news, which of course is that the email of the CIA director has been hacked. So, and just chatting with the author before the event, you know, we're simply going to see more of this. We're going to see more issues arising around the issue of cyber, around hacking and so forth. It's going to be with us for a long time. So let me introduce our speaker and get to the subject, which I know you're all very interested in hearing about. Mary Manjikian is a former Foreign Service officer and current Associate Dean at the Robertson School of Government at Regent University in Virginia Beach. She is an active scholar in the field of intelligence and has written methodological issues dealing with the credibility of intelligence, overcoming bias in intelligence estimates, the politics of accountability and the ethics of international intelligence sharing, which we're obviously doing a great deal of, particularly in the Middle East, if we can figure out who to share it with. She has served as a Fulbright scholar at Durham University's Institute of Advanced Study in the UK, and she's the author of 3 books, one of which certainly piqued my curiosity, The Securitization of Property Squatting in Western Europe. Now, there's a subject I wouldn't have even thought of to write about, but obviously it's going to come to the fore. And she has also written on Threat Talk, the comparative politics of internet addiction. Some of you with teenage kids and others may be quite interested in that. Mary received her BA in Russian from Wellesley College and her MA and PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. She's appeared as an analyst, international affairs and analyst, CBS, CBN News, Al Jazeera, Hugh Hewitt Show, and others, and has had articles in the Washington Times, Christian Science Monitor, and elsewhere. Mary, I think we're all looking forward to this. Please help me welcome Mary Manjikian.
Good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you all this morning in this series. I've been asked to come here to talk about Edward Snowden, and this lecture, as you know, is the end of a series of lectures which have dealt with those engaged in the leaking or sale or passing of classified information, individuals whom we often label as traitors. But the Snowden case is kind of unique, isn't it, in a lot of ways. First, not everybody agrees that he's a traitor. We have seen various film clips of him receiving awards and medals, right? He's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and he won the Bjornson Prize in Norway and Democracy Awards from Sweden and the Netherlands. There was even some discussion at the Democratic debate, if you watched, about how exactly he should be classified and what exactly should occur regarding the actions that he's carried out. So some see him as a whistleblower, calling attention to corrupt and possibly dangerous practices occurring at his place of work. And secondly, unlike most of the other people that you've probably been talking about and learning about, he wasn't caught. He really kind of outed himself, calling attention to the theft of classified materials, which he had committed through revealing himself to the media. So this is a little different too. He didn't pass these materials directly to Russia or China or any place else. Yeah, he simply gave them to the media. Thirdly, he isn't being punished because he was granted asylum in Russia and has never been tried or sentenced thus far within the United States. And fourthly, and most importantly, in many significant ways, he really doesn't resemble most of the other traitors that y'all have been talking about in terms of age, employment status, the fact that he was a contractor, length of tenure, he'd only been working at that particular job for a couple of months, and other factors which we're going to discuss later. In this talk, I really want to do a couple of things. I want to ask you to think a little bit about how we have traditionally thought about security leaks and traitors and the kinds of people who engage in this behavior. And then I want to explain why this particular way of thinking about traitors is outdated in this new environment. And I want to give you some advice about how we need to think about security leaks, traitors, and treason today in this new information and this new employment environment. So, how do we start? It would help if I could figure out how to advance this. Oh, I did not show you this. This is a cartoon, which I think really kind of sums up the dilemma, doesn't it? On the one side, he's wearing devil horns, and on the other side, he's wearing a halo. And some people think he's the devil, and some people think he's a saint. Well, as I was looking for sort of images to illustrate this talk, I put the word traitor into Google Images, and this was one that came up. And I thought, well, that's an interesting image, right? It's Judas Iscariot, and he's kissing Jesus on the cheek as a way of letting the Roman authorities know this is the guy you need to come and arrest, right? So the idea of treason, it's kind of an ancient sort of crime, isn't it, really? And I think what's interesting is it's almost impossible to talk about treason without putting it in this kind of ethical, moral context. And this is when I always like to see sort of the value of the liberal arts education. I don't know if you recall ever having read Dante's Inferno, but if you recall, the description that Dante gives us of hell, it's shaped like a gigantic funnel, right? And the idea is that it gets narrower and narrower and narrower, and the real baddies are right at the bottom. And the person who's at the very center of Dante's Inferno is Judas, because he's considered to have done something that's much worse than what other people have done. And what he has done is he's betrayed someone, right? He's kind of stuck a knife in the back of someone who loved him and someone who trusted him. So you really can't get much worse than being a traitor. That's how we normally think of it. So Judas is considered to have traversed a boundary, betraying those closest to him, stabbing his friends and even his brothers in the back. And this is how we've come to understand, really, I think we almost draw on this image when we think about people. So Weiner and all talk about Aldrich Ames, the CIA agent who gave documents about CIA activities to the KGB. And Weiner tells us, Ames' story provides the quintessential tale of someone who betrays a secret society. Ames is a second-generation CIA operative, or CIA brat, who was hired largely through nepotism rather than an actual set of qualifications. We know that it took him 8.5 years to finish an undergraduate degree. In 1994, Ames was arrested after having spied for the Soviets for 9 years. Although greed is given as the motivation for his actions, in interviews with him, he admits that he feels loyal to the KGB, his true home and affiliation, rather than the CIA, right? So it's a crime of disloyalty, right? He was not loyal to those people, those brothers in the CIA that trusted him. His own actions and the information which he trafficked led to the arrest and the execution of approximately 50 CIA sources in Russia and elsewhere, as well as endangering members of the CIA. For that reason, he is often described as having committed not an act of theft, but rather an act of betrayal, as having violated the trust of his colleagues and sold out his brothers in the fraternity of the CIA. So what we see here is we don't really even have a way of talking about kind of information crimes associated with the intelligence community that isn't kind of moral, ethical in flavor. These are the kinds of terms that we tend to kind of draw on when we begin to talk about people who spy for the enemy. We use words like treason, disloyalty, wrongdoing, traitor, betrayal, compromise, and failing. And we really don't have even another way of talking about this activity, right? You know, what Judas did, it wasn't just kind of law breaking, it was a sin. And kind of implicitly, that's how we then think about these activities. And not only that, but as I'll go on and show you, we tend to assume that the person who committed this sort of moral failure of an act is a morally failed individual, right? There's something wrong with that person. They're not like the rest of us. Something happened in their upbringing that somehow or other they didn't learn how to be loyal. They're, you know, sort of a Freudian would say they're insecurely attached, something like that. And so we use terms like a defector, someone who consciously seeks to break his political or national affiliation with an organization or state, often seeking to cooperate with another receiving state for ideological or other reasons. And it's interesting that word defector because it has the word defect in it, right? It implies that the person is somehow defective, right? There's something wrong with them. We use terms like traitors, those who furnish information to a foreign government while in the employ of their own government. So we can compare these terms to a more kind of morally neutral term, like this term whistleblower, right? I mean, this sounds like the kind of thing you'd read in some kind of government manual, right? It sounds very bureaucratic. One who furnishes information regarding the institutions and practices of his own employer to an outsider, which may be an agency like an inspector general or often to the media, for the purposes of uncovering corruption or implementing reform in the agency's practices and values. So there's kind of these two different types of labels. And the one set of labels is very kind of bureaucratic and legalistic, and then that other set of labels has this whole other flavor to it, this kind of moral, ethical flavor. So our traditional understanding then is that people who commit these types of acts, passing information to the enemy or to the public or the media in such a way that it is used by or benefits the enemy, which is our definition of espionage, are not just lawbreakers. They're also considered to be immoral and deeply flawed. And I noticed that even in the selection of books that you all have for sale on that table out there, that there's a book about how to identify people who are sociopaths. And I thought, well, that's very interesting that we sort of have this assumption that somehow or other treason has to do with mental illness and that it has to do with kind of malformed personalities. So we have tended to treat security leakers within the intelligence community, and this is kind of a sort of, I guess, my kind of pet peeve or sort of the thing that I like to think about a lot is the fact that people who study intelligence tend to be really fascinated by it, and as a result, they don't study anything else. And because of that, there's a tendency to think that anything you're finding in your field of study is somehow unique to your field of study, and that it doesn't really have anything to do with what other people study. And what I have found so often is that we do this when we talk about terrorism and we do this when we talk about intelligence. We assume that terrorists are unlike other types of people, and we assume that traitors are unlike other types of people. They don't belong to some wider class of phenomenon, some wider group of individuals, but rather there's something entirely separate. And so this has happened when we begin to talk about security leaks. We tend to treat them as their own thing, is separate from other types of problems which exist in other types of organizations, right? We think about what happens when someone leaks information out of the intelligence community, and we don't tend to assume that's similar to someone who's giving away kind of the trade secrets of the bank that they work in, right? We don't tend to assume that it's the same as somebody who works at a hospital and talks about the patients, right? We tend to assume it's completely separate. And as a result, we've come up with really idiosyncratic explanations for why these types of security leaks occur. Here's another picture that I got from Google Images that tells us a little something about how we tend to think about traitors, right? So we got this picture here, this guy, and he's got this big knife, and interestingly enough, he's getting ready to stab someone who's working on a computer. So what do we know about traitors? Well, we tend to assume, as I said, that they're unstable, that they're somehow insecurely attached. And something I've been doing over the last couple of years is I love memoirs, and I've been reading memoirs by people who've worked in the intelligence community. A number of people who've actually been convicted of treason have written memoirs, so I've been reading those. And then I've been reading memoirs by people who may have somehow come into contact with these people. People who, they worked at the CIA at the same time Aldrich Ames does. And so they tend to kind of have a section in their autobiographies where they talk about, how come I didn't know, or, did I ever suspect anything? And what ends up happening is we tend to therefore think about these cases kind of in isolation, right? You buy a book and it's a book about Philby, and it starts with where he was born and where he went to school. And so you tend to think about him kind of all by himself. And as a result, you tend to come up with an explanation which has a lot to do with something that occurred in his life. You don't tend to come up with explanations that talk about sort of the architecture of the building where he worked. You don't tend to come up with explanations that talk about styles of leadership among the people who supervised people who were later accused of treason. Instead, you tend to come up with explanations about, did he cheat on his wife, right? Because that's a kind of loyalty, right? Was he disloyal in his family relationships, and how does that then work? And so these are the types of things we end up saying then about traitors. We end up saying that this person is somehow damaged. Maybe he never developed a conscience, right? What was he like in school? Let's go back and talk to his teachers. And that's how we tend to then think about this particular type of crime. And as I've said, because that's kind of how we've set it up in our own minds, that this is sort of the well of words that we draw upon when we start to talk about these people, and these are the ideas, we get headlines like this, right? Here's a picture of, Snowden playing Where's Waldo. Nobody knew where he was. They thought maybe he was in Russia. And CBS calls him a narcissist, right? So they've kind of played armchair psychologist, and they've diagnosed him with a particular mental disability. They've said there's something wrong with him. He's a narcissist. He's decided he's smarter than the rest of us. Often we use this word sociopath then when we start to talk about someone who, sent 50 other people to their deaths as a result of his own activity. We say this is someone who appears to have no conscience or no morals. This is someone who's very committed to serving their own ends and who doesn't really think about the rights of others. We might describe a traitor as being a hustler, a confidence man, a con artist. And again, we go back to this idea of narcissism and someone who has a grandiose sense of their own self-importance. And one of my favorite kind of memoirs is one written by Jack Devine, who was someone who was engaged in covert activities and operations within the CIA. And he's written this wonderful autobiography, and he describes his relationship with Aldrich Ames, the CIA agent convicted of having passed information to the Soviet Union. He describes how he would go over and stand next to Aldrich Ames in the afternoon to see if he could smell alcohol on his breath. I knew it was very important to check up on him, so I would from time to time seek him out in the afternoon and stand very close to him as I would with my teenage children to see if I could detect any liquor on his breath. At the end of the day, I would do it again. And then he writes, of course, years later, the irony wasn't lost on me. While I was saying, shape up, try harder in your job, and you'll be successful, he was probably thinking, you have no idea how successful a Soviet spy I am, as he went about stealing U.S. government secrets. And so, again, Devine's analysis is of the psychological variety. In this autobiography, he goes on and he quotes extensively from reports put together by CIA psychiatrists and psychologists in describing what Ames did and why. He describes him as intellectually smart, but with poor people skills, intellectually lazy, someone with a highly inflated, if not grandiose, sense of his own capabilities, intellect, and importance. And he also quotes a psychiatrist, Dr. Carrie Sulkowitz, who notes that Ames had relatively little insight into his own motivations. Sulkowitz describes him as a narcissist with low self-regard and a need for constant validation. Ames needed to boost his depleted sense of self-worth by turning himself into the opposite, a grandiose figure. He built up this grand facade, but in fact, he was nothing. And this is what's really fascinating. Sulkowitz goes on, and he gives this kind of highly Freudian explanation. He says, on some level, the agency was a stand-in for Ames's father. And his desire to tear down this elite institution that he was admittedly proud to be a part of cannot be separated from his ambivalence towards his father, who was also an agency underachiever. So this is kind of how we tend to think about people then who engage in treason. And we see this again. The Daily Mail ran a headline about Julian Assange where they called him a predatory narcissistic fantasist, right? So we got kind of three kind of diagnoses in here, kind of one after the other. And if you recall sort of the conversation in the media about Assange, there were allegations that he had engaged in some form of non-consensual sexual relationship. And so there was a sense that kind of his personal life and then what he had done professionally were in some way conflated. He made bad decisions on kind of multiple fronts because he was in a sense kind of damaged, and that carried then into every aspect of his life. Here's Kim Philby on the postage stamp that the Soviet Union issued in his honor. And this is from a BBC documentary where, again, they focused in on his alcoholism. And they described him as supremely self-confident. And when we tend to talk about traitors and people who commit espionage, we tend to talk about people who sort of spied and then gave the secrets to the United States, actually using the same kinds of language. Tom Mangold puts forth an explanation when he speaks about the Soviet defector Anatoly Golitsyn. He notes that CIA psychiatrists reportedly described him as someone who exaggerated and was paranoid. Mangold says, there was no question in my mind that Golitsyn was paranoid. No question that he was mentally ill. He showed a marked degree of paranoia. You know, with this kind of condition, one has to take a great deal of what Golitsyn was saying with a grain of salt. He suffered from a form of megalomania. He harbored delusions of grandeur and considered himself far more important than he really was by background and experience. So, sort of at the risk of kind of beating this horse to death, for the most part, we really have used these kind of psychological explanations at both the popular level in newspapers, as I've shown you, and also at the scholarly level in academic journals. So to kind of sum up from an academic journal, they tell us most people who commit espionage have psychological problems or personal issues. And another kind of study talks about the characteristics of traitors. They tend to be experiencing despair. Nobody ever defected because he was happy. And they tend to be compelled out of this sense of dissatisfaction, disillusionment, depression, and defeat. So they're kind of losers, aren't they? And sort of what they do then is a response to an acute, overwhelming life crisis or an accumulation of crises and disappointments. So our explanation then talks about it as kind of being sort of located at that kind of intersection of crisis and opportunity, right? Espionage occurs at the collision of an opportunity, a perceived life crisis, and also a moral failing, which is then activated by a trigger, right? So that's how we understand someone like Aldrich Ames, right? He was a kind of damaged person, and then he had this wife that was really greedy, and then he saw this opportunity to pass this information to the Soviets and to make a lot of money, and so that's how we then tend to think about it. And here's a little excerpt from an interview that Aldrich Ames himself did with the New York Times. And the reason I keep talking about this is because most of these explanations, they don't actually say anything about ideology, do they? They don't really suggest that these people are compelled from some strong ideological position. And Aldrich Ames makes that quite clear. What were your motivations? Money. Money was the motivation. These other ideas and reasons were only enablers, if you will. I mean, plenty of people need money. A number of people throughout the agency's history have stolen money from the agency and have done terrible things for money. Very few have sold secrets to the KGB, and I think one of the reasons is because many of them would have found there were a lot of barriers in the way. I certainly hope so. For me, by 1985, some of those barriers weren't there anymore. I didn't believe that I was affecting the security of this country and the safety of its people. I didn't give that stuff to the Soviets because I thought espionage is a dirty game. I mean, that's trivial. So we tend to focus on kind of very kind of basic kind of human urges then, right? People aren't really, staying awake at night worrying about ideological things, but about personal things. People who then sort of go on to engage in treason. They might have marital problems. They might have a mistress that they can't afford. When we begin to look at people like Bradley/Chelsea Manning, we assume that sort of the fact that he was kind of ambivalent about his gender played into it. They might have an issue like drinking, gambling, money issues, or career. And they might, on some level, then want to seek vengeance or strike back. So again, Bradley Manning, someone else who was kind of armchair diagnosed, Mashable.com calls him an arrogant traitor or an idealist whistleblower. So thus far, there's really only been one kind of large-scale study by a person called Herbeck, who made a database of everyone who'd ever been, caught engaging in treason or espionage against the United States since World War II, came up with a little over 100 cases. And they collected very sort of basic information. What was the profession of the person who was engaged in this activity? How long did it go on for? How much money were they paid? Who did they give the information to? How did it occur? And they conclude that most spies do so for money. Education in the presence of conditions like alcoholism is a good place to start in seeking explanations for why this phenomenon occurs. And when I began looking at this database, it's really kind of interesting. That most of the people who get caught and convicted of espionage are actually really low level, and they don't all end up in the newspapers. So they're probably people that like you never heard of. And they don't steal very much at one time, and they don't end up getting a lot of money. If you want to kind of generalize, they tend to be white guys in their 20s who are in the military. But even this study didn't really dig deep enough in my view, and I'll explain what I mean in a minute. So if we kind of put this all together, if you were to go out and you were to look for a traitor in your organization, these are the kinds of things you might then be looking for. You might be looking for somebody who's immature and impulsive, somebody who has a very low frustration tolerance, sort of kind of has tantrums at the office if he doesn't get his own way, somebody who's unable to delay gratification, someone who acts before they think, and someone who's then prone to overreact. So if you know all this, this would then end up affecting kind of how you went about looking for traitors, right? So we got the picture of this shiny sports car there, right? That's what you do. You go out to the parking lot and you say, well, who's driving that, right? It's him. So if you wanted to then, in a traditional framework, kind of prevent counter-espionage, you'd want to do a better job of screening recruits and those who continue to work in the business in the long term. You'd pay attention to these red flags, like who's an alcoholic, who just got a new car. And so the idea then is that we tend to assume that the best way to prevent espionage is not really to change your organization so much, but really to more closely monitor the people who work there and to do a better job of kind of socializing them into the norms of your organization. And then we get to our friend Edward Snowden, don't we? Does this kind of picture that I've given you of the narcissistic sociopath, does it really describe him? Does he come across as immature? A lot of people kind of commented and they said, in some ways he seemed kind of mature, thoughtful, he'd been thinking these issues through. Unable to delay gratification? I don't know. He had a pretty involved sort of way of getting this information out to the media. He'd certainly done a lot of research in terms of who to contact and so forth. Do we necessarily regard him as someone with an underdeveloped moral conscience? Well, the people who nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize, I guess, probably don't. Though those two things don't really go together, do they? Nobel Peace Prize, underdeveloped moral conscience. And was he someone who then had sort of stunted moral growth? And so I was kind of dissatisfied with these traditional explanations, partially because they didn't explain Edward Snowden, but for a couple of other reasons as well. As I said, it implies that treason is completely unlike any other crime. It suggests that the only way to explain what happened is to look at the individual. But often, if you're a criminologist and you're interested in why crimes are occurring, you don't look just at the individual, you look at the environment in which it occurred, who the boss was, how it was allowed to occur. And the problem with this kind of psychological explanation is, for all you know, there might be multiple people working at the CIA who are pathological narcissists, but not all of them then went on to commit treason. So it's an insufficient explanation. And again, it goes to this idea of kind of intelligence exceptionalism, assuming that everything that occurs in intelligence is somehow unique to intelligence. So what I became interested in was, are there other kind of environments in which people take information that doesn't belong to them and give it to other people? Where else does this occur? Where else do these kind of information crimes occur? And I work with a guy who mostly does human resources, and I said to him, what should I read? And he said, read about Enron, read about the collapse of Arthur Andersen, read about insider trading. So I started kind of reading about these other types of information crimes. And just, I guess because I was interested, I read a lot about the mafia and people who turned state's evidence, right? Because they're kind of like traitors, aren't they? The mafia is a fraternity, it's a brotherhood, and then there are these people who go out and they give this information to other people. And so the idea is there's a fair number of places where these types of information crimes occur. And what's interesting is most of the insider trading literature talks about leadership failures at the top, as well as the development of internal incentive systems which kind of forced people to be dishonest. All the books that people who worked for Enron wrote, they talk about how they were asked to kind of fill out these employee forms, and they knew that if they filled them out a certain way, people were going to get fired, and they didn't want the people to get fired because they kind of liked them, so they made up the data. And so it's a very different kind of dysfunctional workplace type of explanation. I began reading a lot about corrupt regimes because in corrupt regimes, the idea is people get confused about what's theirs and what belongs to the state. They start to think that the resources of the state are theirs and that their resources belong to the state. You know, like if you were to take classified information that belonged to the State Department and you were to take it home and put it on your personal server, that might be somebody who was a little confused about what was theirs and what was private and what was public. And so that's what's kind of interesting, is we're getting more and more of those types of activities and issues, aren't we? We're getting a lot of issues where people are confused about what's personal and what's public. And again, this corruption frame, it says the problem often is people at the top who aren't making it clear what's public and what's private, and they refer to something called poor role definition, where you're not really sure. And I think this is particularly interesting because of the whole revolution with information technology, right? You know, we all answer work emails when we're home. We all, some of us shop online when we're at work. And so people they tend to kind of blur and mesh together their personal and their professional roles. And this may kind of help to set the stage then for things that have happened. And I looked at other kinds of theft that take place in government service, right? Things like visa fraud, which could also be seen as a form of corruption, people selling things that aren't theirs in order to profit personally. Things like the case in 2015 when Foreign Service Officer Michael Sestak was sentenced to 64 months imprisonment for receiving $3 million in bribes for selling visas in Vietnam. And just like a spy, he was recruited and he was targeted by a Vietnamese business person who made him feel like one of the family. And what I was struck by was the fact that we use such different explanations to describe what happens in these types of instances. We don't assume that these other types of information crimes happen for ideological reasons, and we don't tend to look at sort of whether or not the person that engaged in these activities was morally damaged in some way. Instead, you know, with the visa ones, we ask how many people had access to those stamps and why weren't they better locked up and looked after? We treat visa fraud like any other crime, but we treat espionage as fundamentally different, and I'm not sure that's accurate. So it turns out that there's actually a lot of writing on something called employee deviance, which is defined as voluntary behavior that violates significant organizational norms and in doing so threatens the well-being of an organization, its members, and both. We have this picture here of a fellow who is sleeping on the job. And I began wondering if it wasn't more useful to think of Snowden as a deviant employee rather than as a traitor. And what our counterintelligence policy might look like if we attempted to root out and identify employee deviants rather than potential counter-spies, and to ask larger questions about why many people right now in many different workplaces seem to be confused about what the norms are regarding how to treat and think about classified information. And here's what's interesting about employee deviance. I don't know if any of you recognize this picture here. It's from that wonderful film Office Space, which is kind of like a master's thesis on employee deviance. So you can ask yourself, have you ever violated a rule at your workplace? Have you ever come in a few minutes late, did a little online shopping on Cyber Monday, called in sick because the weather was really nice? And this way of understanding human behavior says that most people are at least a little deviant, but most people understand what the limits are on that behavior. So in other words, employee deviance kind of runs along a spectrum from doing something relatively minor up to and including criminal behaviors. And that's what you see in office space, right? You know, they kind of work their way up from kind of not wearing a tie to work to eventually sort of, taking down the whole organization and literally burning it down. And the idea with the employee deviance is there's often not really a clear black and white line between major and minor violations, stealing a pen versus stealing secrets. And so the idea is that people who are deviant employees aren't actually different than the rest of us, because most of us have probably done something that's deviant. But people might gradually then move along that spectrum. So why is this important? Well, it kind of depoliticizes the phenomenon of leaking. And it says leaking is really just a type of theft of company property, right? And this perspective says there's nothing really unique about the security leaker. He's not a unique kind of criminal, but a more general class of criminal. And so a lot of the questions that I like to ask is, this particular individual who's been accused of treason, if they weren't working at the CIA and the NSA, they were working somewhere else. They were working in a chain of grocery stores or something. Would they still have committed a similar type of crime? So as we said, and I think if you think about this, sort of these typical leakers are these low-ranking individuals. They're usually kind of junior enlisted guys, motivated by finances, and they receive a relatively small amount of money for committing espionage. So, I always think, well, if they were working at like a garage, they were fixing cars, they might have stolen car parts, right? But they happened to be working in a secure environment, so instead they stole classified information. So that's kind of how I want to think about this then. And I will eventually get back to Snowden, but I just briefly want to suggest there are many cases of espionage that you can understand using the employee deviance model. This is John Kiriakou, who worked for the CIA for 14 years. When he retired, he went on and he worked as an analyst for a news agency. And he claims he just literally got confused about what was and wasn't classified. He says he got carried away. He wanted to kind of please his new employer, and he ended up telling his new employer about torture practices, including waterboarding. Some people would say this was really kind of deviance. This was somebody who kind of got confused about the norms of their organization and kind of slipped over the edge. Clayton Lonetree, usually we say, this is the fella that was responsible for putting all the bugs in the new American embassy in Russia during the height of the Cold War. And we usually say it was a honey trap, right? He met this beautiful Russian woman, and she said, hey, can I come to work with you sometime? And can I bring my uncle, who's in Soviet military intelligence? And he said, sure. And we all know what happened as a result. But you can also think about this as being somebody who gradually traversed the boundary between appropriate and inappropriate conduct. And what's interesting then about this employee deviance model is it says we might want to look at what workplaces are doing wrong, and not just at what's wrong with individuals. And this is what I think is really interesting, is it says that employee deviance is more likely to occur along the margins of an organization. So in other words, if you're not the main organization, but you're in like the satellite office, you can probably get away with more stuff, right? And you might not be as well socialized into the norms of that organization. And maybe if you're a contractor, that's a little different too, right? So that's what's interesting. And it also talks a lot about how people who are low-ranked look at people above them, and if, say, they see the people at the top of the organization engaging in any form of wrongdoing, then they kind of learn some lessons, and they say, well, Bob's doing it, I guess I can do it too. And so these are some things we can then learn about by looking at this. And indeed, I would argue that CIA Director Wolseley actually provided what sounds like an employee deviance model when he described what happened to Aldrich Ames. He says there was a series of small mistakes which formed a cascade, not one smoking gun. A series of small misdeeds by a number of people rather than major mistakes by a few. There was not one villain whose failures directly led to the fiasco. He ended up identifying 23 senior managers who in his view were accountable for Ames' betrayals. People were demoted, but most chose to resign instead. And so the idea was that a lot of people were aware that Aldrich Ames was a really lousy employee. And nonetheless, they sort of didn't cotton on to kind of how serious the problem was. Kim Philby talks about this as well. And I think if you look at his writing, it's actually more of this corruption frame. He says he saw the information that he had as his property, and he then traded the information to bolster his own self-esteem and to create personal connections abroad And he too talks about a dysfunctional workplace. He says, I frequently help myself to classify documents from projects outside my area of expertise, which I didn't actually have permission to read. And when people asked me about it, I said I was just intellectually interested in these matters. He talks about how he was specifically interested to be posted to Washington because he'd probably get access to even more data. And again, once again, he was far away from the flagpole. And I think we can even think, once we start to think about these information crimes, we can think about General David Petraeus. We know that in 2011, he gave several books with classified information to his biographer, Paula Broadwell, with whom he was having an affair. A key piece of evidence later, when he was asked to resign, came from Broadwell herself. She talked about a conversation where she asked him about the black books that he was keeping when he was the top commander in Afghanistan, which contained top secret code word intelligence. And 3 weeks later, he gave the books to her, and she kept them for several days. So this is kind of that employee deviance model. Maybe it didn't appear to be ideological. It just appeared to be somebody who was kind of a bad employee who hadn't been properly disciplined. So now, finally, we get to Edward Snowden. One final thing about the literature on employee deviance, it says deviant practices might peak in situations of rapid technological change, where employee and workplace norms and practices and guidance haven't caught up yet to the new technology. And so we see this with the intelligence community. They really had been struggling with enforcing and establishing these norms since the early 1990s. And I kind of went back historically and found out that in 1995, John M. Deutsch, who held the position of Director of Central Intelligence, was actually investigated for having used a home computer in which he was doing both classified and unclassified work at the same time. He had used this computer to access an internet service provider, the internet, his bank, and the Department of Defense. And so this had kind of been going on for a while then. If you'd paid any attention to the Ashley Madison scandal, there were a number of people from the intelligence community who had apparently been shopping for affair partners using their government email addresses while they were at work. So this suggests that this is kind of not really a new phenomenon, and it's not really a unique phenomenon. And so what we begin to see is there's a fair amount of selective enforcement and ambiguity when it comes to thinking about information-type crimes. And it's also possible that a lot of people within these corporations don't really have a consistent position on many of these new and emerging issues, and that their positions might evolve over time. So this is what we know about Snowden. We know he was born in 1983, and that he was a member of a family with a long tradition of government service. He was a legacy. His dad was a Coast Guard officer. His sister worked as a government lawyer. His grandfather was in the military. And he grew up in those Maryland suburbs around D.C. So in other words, he looked an awful lot like an awful lot of other people who probably end up being defense contractors in this area. And so that might have kind of caused the recruiters to kind of think positively about him and trust him a little bit. So we have these dates. He's 16 in 1999. He drops out of high school, and he eventually gets a number of kind of computer certifications that are very highly valued by these recruiters. 2006, he joins the CIA as a systems administrator. 2007, they send him to Geneva, Switzerland as a systems operator. And we find out that he got into some trouble when he was in Geneva. Apparently, he was looking at some stuff he wasn't supposed to be looking at, and he was disciplined for that. Isn't that interesting? In 2009, he resigns from the CIA, and he goes to work for Dell. And then in 2012, he gets even farther away. He's transferred to Hawaii as an NSA contractor for Dell. And this is where he begins, we think, downloading classified information. He was actually involved in this project. He was supposed to be migrating information to this separate facility in Hawaii so that if there was ever, God forbid, something like an EMP, which took out the CIA's computers here, we'd have this backup then in Hawaii. But he says, he was kind of given a great deal of autonomy, that nobody was really watching what he was doing, and he was kind of surprised himself at sort of how much that he was doing this single-handedly. And he says in retrospect that he tried to express his concerns about possible illegal actions by the NSA to his colleagues, but that nobody took him seriously or seemed willing to do anything to address the situation. March 2013, he takes another job in Hawaii with Booz Allen Hamilton, and he says he actually took a pay cut to get this job because it would give him more access. And then finally, in June 2013, he's terminated for violations of the firm's code of ethics and firm policy. So he's a little different than these other fellas that we looked at who kind of joined the CIA, presumably their senior year in college, and stay there until they're 65, right? He didn't work for the same organization for all these years. He actually had 3 different jobs just during the 6 years that we're kind of tracking him here. And the point is that it wasn't merely an impulse that caused him to download information, but it was planned. So how do we explain what he did and why he wasn't stopped? Well, when we compare him to traditional spies, we can start with the fact that he was a millennial, right? And what do we know about millennials? Well, an article from Forbes magazine says the average worker today stays at each of his jobs for 4.4 years. 91% of millennials expect to stay in a job for less than 3 years. This means they will have 15 to 20 jobs over the course of their working lives. So you can't really take 18 months to recruit somebody if they're only going to be in their job for 3 years. And you can't kind of watch, what their third car looks like in the CIA parking lot as opposed to the previous 2 if they're only going to be in that job for 18 months or 3 years. It's hard to really be able to talk about what they usually do when you don't know them that well. It's hard to be able to talk about whether or not their conduct is out of character when they're so much younger and kind of still developing as people, really. And here's another thing that's kind of interesting about Snowden. He worked in this growing national security complex that included lots of different types of employees. There might actually be multiple people working in the same office. And I'm sure some of you have experienced this, and some of the people are working for the NSA, and some people are contractors, and they might be paid different salaries. They might answer to different people, and when you recruit then for a position, and to some degree you're kind of recruiting to fill a position rather than to hire a specific person. And so he says he kind of had some resentment. He knew that there were people in his office that were being paid a lot more. And as he moved between employers, he was able to consider multiple competing offers. And the chain of information between the employers wasn't always very good. One of the best analyses of Snowden I've actually seen comes from an article which ran in the New Republic in February 2014, where the author says Snowden was a member of this hacker culture. He came into this organization with a number of values which were like hacker values. They weren't really NSA values. And so a number of people have gone back and they've looked at particularly some writing that he did in an online discussion group called Ars Technica between technical people, where he kind of described who he was. And he said he was a libertarian. He had given money to Rand Paul. He talks about being concerned about the increasing size of government. So he wasn't really a partisan. It wasn't really a left-right issue. But he talked about his support for gun rights. We think he probably was a Republican. And we know that he liked the Cato Institute. And in this author, in the New Republic, the author quotes Peter Ludlow, a philosophy professor at Northwestern, who talks about how there's a potent combination of tech hacker libertarian philosophy and anti-authoritarian politics, which when combined can form a movement. And they say this is the philosophy behind Anonymous. So what we can see is Snowden appeared to have kind of competing loyalties, right? Which group did he belong to? And historically, when the intel community is worried about competing loyalties, they've asked questions like, are you a first-generation American? Are you a communist, right? They haven't really ever asked, are you a hacker? But nonetheless, it's something you might want to begin to think about. So what are some hacker values? And this is a picture of a hacker who's engaged in a hack where they attempted to show how poor the security was in many hotels in the United States when you get one of those swipey key cards by breaking into hotels. Hackers tend to feel that, information wants to be free, information should be shared, software should be shared, you shouldn't pay for it, movies should be shared, you should be able to download them. They believe that it's appropriate to violate boundaries to get information. They're hostile to secrecy, they have a distaste for authority, and they like to run these kind of hacks which show that they are playfully clever. We know from the article in the documentary as well that Snowden showed up at work and he had stickers on his computer supporting the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which tends to believe that defending your rights in the digital world is paramount, that people should not be people should be able to be anonymous in cyberspace. They should be able to do what they want. Nobody should be able to track them or follow them. And then the other one says champions of individual privacy in cyberspace. And so Laura Poitras, who made the documentary, she actually raises the intriguing argument. She says, Snowden had been sending out signals for a while that he probably shouldn't be trusted. But the people tasked with keeping information within an organization somehow missed these signals. And although she doesn't say it, I think it really shows how outdated and inappropriate our ways of attempting to identify spies are and attempting to think about security risks. And one thing that's interesting is if you poll young people in particular and you ask them if they support Edward Snowden, 47% of them say yes. Which suggests that, you know, if you're recruiting people in their 20s to work for an intelligence organization right now, you might want to kind of keep that in mind, that half of them might have really different values. And so what this presentation really shows is that if you think about sort of this being about employee deviance rather than kind of mental illness, we know that minor boundary violators can go on and become major boundary violators. These behaviors which are occurring in peripheral organizations are very important. And this notion that sort of people at the bottom are watching how behavior violations by those at the top are presented. And interestingly, there was an unsigned article in kind of a cyber tech magazine in the UK that described Snowden as a rogue employee. It talked about how the most serious threat right now to any information organization is this insider threat, someone within the organization who's going to eventually create problems by not following policies. And they say that's really what he was, is he was a classic example of an insider threat. In statistics, even in kind of private corporations, many corporations admit they've had to discipline employees for accessing data that they weren't actually authorized to access. Do you remember the presidential election where somebody got in trouble for looking at visa applications from celebrities? Pardon me? Yeah, and so this has been going on for quite some time, this idea that they say, you know, people might have a peek at someone else's personnel file. They might want to satisfy their curiosity as to whether they're being paid the same as anyone else. So this kind of stuff goes on a good deal in a lot of organizations. And I kind of apologize for sort of ending with this disturbing image, but there's a reason for it. If you recall in 1999, during the Columbine attacks in that high school in the United States, one of the first things that the media did is they went on and they found this guy's AOL member profile for Eric Harris. And in this profile, they said, oh my gosh, he says right here, he says, kill them all. He says, you know, don't be worried by a little bloodshed. And if we go on sort of historically then, we can find a number of cases where people have really kind of telegraphed the fact that they have these competing loyalties and that their public persona and their private persona are very, very different. We can think about Nidal Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter, where later we went, oh my gosh, this is someone who was participating in these jihadist discussions. And so what this suggests is that if you really want to think about who's going to end up being a traitor, you might want to begin to ask questions like, is this person opposed to practices of secrecy? Does this person belong to groups or organizations that advocate violating organizational boundaries? What is this person's orientation towards authority? And then you might actually want to go out and see everything that they have ever posted online. And it's kind of interesting because the labor laws aren't real clear on this. They aren't real clear in a lot of organizations what exactly you can and can't find about someone in terms of social media background research. But what I hope I've done in this presentation then is to kind of bring you full circle. Previously, we assumed if somebody was a traitor, they had a personality flaw. We look for evidence of things like mental illness. But it turns out all we really need to know is what people believe. You don't need a polygraph when someone belongs to a website where they're consciously putting forth their ideas. And so what I hope this presentation might do is it might also cause us to be able to think a little bit about how we might reform this process then. So thank you so much for your attention.
Go ahead and stay up. No, you go ahead and stay up there. Take questions. I told her there's no way to avoid questions in this crowd. Yes. Okay. Let's see. Who's? Laura, we got somebody over there?
Hold on, I'm coming.
Right here. Thank you, Amanda. Okay.
What level of clearance did Snowden hold? And how did he ever pass a poly?
You know, I don't actually know the answer to that
No,
specific.
but it's never come out.
Sure.
I would just, if I could, just to add to what you're saying, I can pass a poly this morning and turn traitor tomorrow. There's no way to predict future behavior from a poly. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting question. I've never seen that he took the poly.
It never says what his clearance was.
But he could have passed it having not done what he eventually did.
There is a definitional issue that traitor is people who do it in a way that we disapprove of. You could debate historically whether Washington was a traitor for having taken up arms against the crown, whether Robert E. Lee was a traitor. There is a poem that begins, "None dare call it treason," or we criticize Ames, who undoubtedly sent KGB, CIA agents within the KGB to their deaths, but the KGB could say that those giving information to Americans were traitors to the Soviet Union. So it's a lot of it is simply often by calling someone a traitor, you're simply expressing your moral disapproval of
Sure.
whom that benefited from their actions, rather than any objective standard.
The question is, will we ever get an Edward Snowden postage stamp?
Do you want to respond?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a very fair way of describing it.
I guess I have a problem with it in that having been in operations, having run agents, having been Ames supervisor for a period of times, I knew Ames quite well. He helped me with the defection of the highest ranking defector ever to come to the United States, Shevchenko, and he did a fair job. And he had not yet turned traitor, so he didn't have anything written on his forehead that I could read. But so many of the people who cooperated with us during the Cold War, my sense that many of them acted out of a sense of moral revulsion at their own system, which was the Soviet system. You look at Tolkachev, the billion-dollar spy, that book just came out. Shevchenko and others, there was an ideological part to it, and they reviled their own system and thought that what America stood for and was doing was better. In other words, there was a moral component to it, I thought. So I have a little trouble with one man's traitors, another man's prey. I can see it on a superficial level. But in knowing some of these people and some of the defectors, there was an underlying revulsion at their regime. Yes.
But my response would be that, given that they were a Cold War adversary,
Yes.
they couldn't be really sure that what they were giving us was not harming the Soviet Union beyond what they intended. So their morals, I'm sure, were, at least from our point of view, were of the highest. But any government has a legitimate reason to prevent its secrets from going to
Yes.
a hostile foreign power.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, you were talking about Snowden, and he went to Europe with the CIA, and you said he was disciplined while he was in Europe. What was he disciplined for specifically?
He had apparently been accused of accessing things that he didn't need to have access to. And so it seems to be this pattern that you see of, either you're incredibly curious or you're strategic.
And what was his job? What was his job title when he was at Dell and at Booz?
I don't know the specific job title. He was just some form of kind of technology supervisor.
He was a system administrator at one point, which pretty much gives you access to everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it does not. Yeah. Somebody said something, but you need a mic.
She said, no, it does not. Hold on, please, hold on.
Yeah, hold on. Just your comments sound interesting,
Yeah.
so.
Being a Unix system administrator does not give you access to everything. You have security passwords, and all you really generally have is access to the directory structures. If it's done correctly, you do not have access to the data inside of it or the data inside of the database.
But you, as a system administrator, in other words, the system you're administering, you have access to the information within that system. No?
No, sir, not the data, just the structure, but not the data.
Okay, but not the data.
Correct.
Yeah, this was the great fear of the leadership in the agency for many years. Once we got in computers and so the automation and computers, But that's an interesting
Generally,
comment.
a DBA does not
Yeah.
even have access, if it's done correctly, to the actual data within the columns of the table. All they monitor is the security groups and the data structures, the algorithms for keeping it optimized.
One of the things notable about Snowden, and even Hansen did this, was hacking into the director's system and so forth, saying, well, I was just checking out the system. But in the case of Snowden, I'd be interested in your comments on how he accessed all the other information he did from simply having one assignment as a system administrator. He was literally scarfing up everything he could of other systems, specifically the data. That is what they were after.
Having known my nephew was in the class with him at Booz Allen, and so I got some information from him, and my cousin was actually one of his managers who sent him to Hawaii. He went to that class specifically, as you say, for that job and taken a pay cut. He would have had to hack in to even a higher level than he should have had, so somehow he was scarfing in, or I call them scarfing in other people's passwords, either through overlooking, but the system itself should have been documenting each keystroke from every individual employee. A log should have been created and monitored.
Yeah, so he was actually hacking from within.
May I say something else?
Sorry.
There's an interview with the NSA director, Michael Hayden, where he says that the real issue about Snowden isn't actually any specific information that he provided to the media. And he gives this analogy. He says that you could give the media a bucket of water, or you could draw them a picture of the plumbing system. And he says that what Snowden really did was he described the methods that were being used, and that was actually a lot more damaging than any specific information, which I think is an interesting way to think about it.
Which methods was he describing? Because as a Unix administrator, you're confined to the Unix operating system and how security is applied to individuals and groups and supergroups.
You got me.
There's a hand right there, Amanda Young.
I had the thought in reading about Snowden, and my history may be deficient, but the thought crossed my mind that Snowden might be characterized as the Ted Hall of his generation. The book Bombshell discusses this young man in his 20s who worked on the ignition device at Los Alamos, and on his own volition, for no money, but simply motivated by the thought in his mind that such information should not be restricted to one power, that the playing field needed to be more level. He voluntarily walked in and found a way to disclose the information, was not caught, and died. He was subsequently revealed post Follow the Wall and died in England. But his motivation was non-monetary. I never read that he was a psychopath, and the extent to which Snowden's actions could be characterized as leveling the playing field between members of a democracy and their state. I'd be interested in your feedback.
Well, I think if you wanted to make a counter argument, you'd say it's fairly narcissistic for one individual in their 20s to think that they can alter history in that way. To be sort of the person upon which history is going to pivot, I mean, that seems kind of psychologically different than the rest of people think about their work. And I suppose that's how you might then respond to that. And I think that's where sort of the narcissism charge kind of came from when people talked about Snowden, is they said, here's somebody who really and truly thinks that he's going to change history, which is, I don't know, perhaps a fair argument.
Well, wait, I'm going to go to some folks who want to talk.
We're starting to distinguish between the data itself and the methods
Yes.
by which it's retrieved, or the fact that it is being.
Right.
I guess my always opinion has been that Snowden could have, if his end was to tell people that we were doing this and it's not right, he could have done that in 2 days with one sample. But yet for 6 months or a year or whatever, he kept feeding out information after the point had been made that did damage to us and a lot of other countries for that matter. So he went way beyond the scope of somebody I think who would just be called a whistleblower. I don't know what his rationale was for that.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of kind of gaps in the story, things that we don't fully know.
Did you have your, yeah.
Been mentioned several times that Aldrich Ames treachery resulted in the death of 50 folks who were supplying information to the U.S. In both the Manning case and the Snowden case, one of the initial reactions to the revelations from people in charge was, oh, this is going to result in people dying. Is there any legitimate, credible body count for either of them?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know if anybody else has heard anything differently, but the thing is, he has not yet been charged with a specific set of charges in American court. That if he were charged with espionage, the statute then would, I believe, require them to furnish some information about the types of damages which have resulted. So that may be something we'll see later.
Yeah, in other words, is there a sealed indictment, or do we know?
I don't think there is.
Okay. Because there could be a sealed indictment
true, yeah,
with those charges, yeah.
This is for you, sir. You said that during the Cold War, you found that most of the traitors defected because they were morally repulsed by their own system. And that sounds like what Snowden did. He was morally repulsed by our system, so he went abroad.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question.
Okay. By your definition, which you experienced during the Cold War, you found that the people were morally repulsed by their own system and therefore they defected. It seems to me that Snowden was morally repulsed by our system and therefore he defected. Would you go along with that?
It's an interesting way to put it. I mean, I think he certainly, it is interesting to hear him. For someone of his background and education, he's extraordinarily articulate. And I think you could make a case that that would be how he would feel, yes. Or how he would define himself, yes. Yeah.
I'd be interested in your comments on how all of your work applies to Robert Hansen. Because he made a lot of money, and I don't know if the smears in the news made him seem pretty wacko, but he sure sounds like it.
Well, I guess that's what's interesting to me is sort of this penchant for telling these psychological stories, I think kind of comes out of the fact that that's kind of how we've been trained to think about these issues. And I spent some time reading The $1 Billion Spy as well, and I was really intrigued in that particular story that they take Tolkachev's history back like 3 or 4 generations, and they say, look how poorly his grandmother was treated. And it's just an interesting way of thinking about people's motivations to assume that kind of they're predominantly sort of motivated by these kind of patriotic kind of revenge type scenarios. And again, what the sort of this database suggests is that's not really necessarily the case. That I know that the writing on Hansen talks a lot about how he had financial problems. And I don't know, to me that seems just, they say sort of, the idea of Occam's razor, that the simplest explanation is often sort of the best explanation, that to explain something, you shouldn't have to go back 3 or 4 generations. There's probably a much more straightforward explanation.
Do you have another question, or are you building on that?
But from what I've read, he also allowed one of his buddies watching him and his wife have sex. So that he does that. Oh, never been married, so. No, I'm sorry.
No, I can wait. This gentleman's had his hand up for some time.
I hope we got that on video.
I think we're comparing Snowden to the wrong people in terms of like Aldrich Ames or Robert Hansen and so forth, folks who were actual spies who committed espionage for the sake of money. I think much better comparisons are to people like Thomas Drake, who was highlighted in the in this 2011 article in Smithsonian Magazine, who was a legitimate whistleblower within the NSA. There was also an article in the September 2012 edition of Smithsonian Magazine about, I believe it was two gentlemen who were CIA operatives who were kind of referred to as second story men who did, break-ins and burglaries on behalf of the CIA, and who tried to highlight inadequate practices within the agency and were very, very badly treated by the agency in that regard. They were legitimate whistleblowers. And I certainly think that Snowden did not defect. He tried to get to South America to avoid punishment in this country and got stuck, obviously, in Russia because the U.S. revoked his passport. I think the real comparison ought to be, instead of Aldrich, Ames, Robert Hansen, and the like, is to draw parallels between Snowden and Edward Drake and the other gentleman I mentioned, and tie it into whistleblowers and his motivation for highlighting practices which are arguably in violation of the Constitution.
Right behind him, there's a couple of hands there, yeah.
I'm going to go to someone else who hasn't spoken yet.
Thanks. I'm interested in, you seem to imply there's some kind of organizational culpability involved here. And you noted the employees at Enron who weren't filling out forms properly. We've seen reports that USIS did the investigation on Snowden's security clearance,
Sure.
but that was fraudulent, and that indeed the investigator who conducted the investigation's clearance was also fraudulently investigated. So these organizations have rules in place, and well-minded people have developed policies, well-intended people, yet they don't follow their own rules. So what I know you say that organizations should vet people electronically. How do policymakers, look within our own organizations
Sure.
to create a better mechanism?
Well, there's some literature where they talk about an organization that's corruptogenic. And so this is this idea that an organization somehow or other creates the conditions that would allow corruption to flourish. Corruptogenic. Have you ever heard about, an obesogenic environment is, a neighborhood with no sidewalks that's very close to a candy store or something. And so a corruptogenic environment is described often as one where there's a fair amount of, they call it organizational slack. And so it might be an organization where they're growing really, really quickly. And so maybe they're adding people and they're not being as careful in security clearances or something like that. In an organization where, because they're growing quickly, you hear about sort of the CIA right after 9/11, right? Everybody was all smashed together in all these cubicles because we didn't have enough space. Well, that might be a good environment then for people to look over each other's shoulders and read something that they're not supposed to. Another thing about a corruptogenic environment is this idea of people having a poor role definition. And I'm always struck when I read these wonderful memoirs by people who've been in the CIA, where they talk about how, I had to go and I had to meet with a contact and I wanted to look real natural, so I brought my family along and we pretended we were on vacation. Well, that's an interesting way then of kind of conflating personal and professional roles, right? A lot of the memoirs talk about, we were looking for so-and-so in Pakistan, so at the last minute, we bought all these plane tickets and we bought them in cash, right? You sort of have this sense that maybe if you work for, an intelligence organization, they might give you a little more leeway on, providing receipts on your travel voucher or something like that. And so these are all then kinds of practices that might make it easy to create that slack where to some degree there's a little less oversight. And I think when you think about the intelligence community, you think, well, they got to have that slack, right? You're not really going to tell someone they can't go and, meet with someone because they didn't fill out their travel voucher or something. But nonetheless, if you create an environment where people are not necessarily having to explain every single action, they have more autonomy, they kind of mesh together their professional and their personal roles, you might get some more of these types of practices then.
It seems to me that when the activities that you suggest of somebody constantly throughout his working career poking around, hacking, violating boundaries, looking at stuff he shouldn't, does not really speak to a social conscience who has an aha moment and says, oh, we're doing something we shouldn't be doing. We got to tell everybody about it. It really speaks much more to the hacker culture and a libertarian culture that says, oh, nothing should be secret, we should get this all out. which is a little bit more, I came in very undecided on this issue. But I think what you're telling me about his background and his work history moves me more to the, I guess, the traitor side than the hero side.
Yeah, I think, they say, kind of hindsight is 20/20. It certainly seems like now in retrospect, you think, well, you probably shouldn't have hired somebody who didn't believe in secrecy to work for the NSA. But, I think that it's very easy to kind of see this kind of from a kind of historic point. That I don't know you necessarily would have seen it the same way when you were in it.
You remember there were some events that happened early on in Snowden's career. He reacted very conservatively. He said those people should be shot. Remember that his background was one of quite conservative outlook,
Yes.
based probably on his people in the family having been in government and so forth.
Yes.
And he grew up in that atmosphere initially.
Yes.
And it was later that he developed the other thoughts that led him
and
to.
I think, again,
in
this
fact-
idea of kind of being a contractor working these short-term contracts, that previously there was a sense that if you went into the CIA when you were 21, they could groom you. They could gradually, over time, they could teach you their values. And this is something else that I've been really, really interested in, is kind of how does someone who becomes a policeman learn how to have a certain orientation towards policing? And they learn it from older people within their organizations who often sit down and tell them stories. They say, let me tell you about a time I made a mistake. Let me tell you about a time I overreacted. And I don't know how that learning then occurs when you mostly have these contractors working on these very short contracts and people constantly sort of turning over.
So you point out that there are a lot of different people, and they may have a wide range of reasons for whistleblowing or leaking information. The more interesting aspect to me is the moral question: is the man a traitor, or is he doing something that's patriotic? And the comparison, it seems to me, we're told that Daniel Ellsberg, releasing his information, spent 2 years of his life trying to work within the system to get a change in a world that was exploding and people were being killed, in his view, needlessly. Now, it seems to me we're in a lot of speculation and
Yes.
pseudo-psychiatry on Snowden. There's yet information to come out, but a key piece of information is, given all the options that he had, working within the system or doing something that makes it very public and potentially very dangerous, and as a man far less experienced than Ellsberg was within the system.
Yes.
Did he try? Was there any attempt to work within the system and show things that James Clapper came in front of a Senate committee and lied about? I mean, there's something reasonable that he could have done, it seems to me.
Yeah, in the interviews, he kind of says, I tried to talk to people about that, but it's not really kind of fleshed out, on this date I went to this person and I said this and they shut me down. And so, I imagine probably, at some point he's going to write an autobiography or something, and we'll get the answers to those questions, because he claims he did, but we don't really know the specifics.
I think there's one email of record, but it's pretty minor.
Yeah.
One comparison that comes to mind that no one has mentioned and might be ideal if this series had a fifth session was the publication by the Chicago Tribune in 1941 of U.S. war plans against Hitler. It's commonly believed that Hap Arnold, who was an isolationist, then leaked it, but it's never been proven, but it did thread several needles at once. Roosevelt was able to say that the Chicago Tribune, which was owned by a major enemy of his, would stoop to nothing and disclose U.S. plans. Churchill, who was bugging Roosevelt about getting in the war, could see in a newspaper that the United States was going to get into the war. Hitler, who eventually lost his nerve and declared war in the United States, found through his agents that the U.S. already had war plans against Germany. whoever released it technically knew it was secret, but it did somehow thread several needles all at once that needed to be threaded.
I think you've got a book there.
Let me turn the conversation around just a little bit. The lecture last week on John Ellsberg was excellent in terms of he became very disillusioned by blatant lying by the administration in relation to the war in Vietnam. What is your considered opinion, and ma'am, your considered opinion on the programs, the legality and the propriety of the programs that Snowden exposed?
Just a little question.
Well, you directed the question at both of us. Yeah, in the case of Daniel Ellsberg, whom I've met, I think he was a very patriotic and idealistic individual, and has remained so. And interestingly, has associated himself with Snowden. I think that one of the things that disappoints me in some of these cases, and I would specifically mention that case, that is Daniel Ellsberg, as well as these 2 or 3 people from NSA, I think Wimpy and Drake, clearly tried to work within the system. And it is very hard to believe to me that, and they went to congressmen. Congressmen certainly have access to the leadership of Congress. It's the leadership that selects the select committee. So it's disappointing to me that they were banging their heads against the wall in doing that, because that is the system. The IGs, the Congress, and so forth. So that's very disappointing to me that that happened. In the case, and then you're also asking about Snowden? The activities he exposed. You know, it's interesting. One of the president's first reactions as president was, I deplore what he's done, I welcome the debate. So clearly there were things here that needed to be and are being discussed. My understanding is one of the great objections by people in the intelligence community as to what he did was, yes, he touched on some of the domestic collection, but much of what he exposed had to do with what we collect overseas, and that's what we're supposed to be doing. Yeah, we are supposed to be, I mean, the whole thrust of NSA is to collect signals intelligence wherever it can, or specifically where the needs are. And Snowden went well beyond simply exposing a domestic program. That's where I would fault him. Yes.
Yeah, I think that one of the debates that has really come out of this is this question of what is our expectation of privacy. And that's a norm that I don't think has been fully decided. My sense is the NSA was saying, kind of regardless of what the laws are, we're acting on the assumption that you don't have a right to do anything privately in cyberspace, and that there's no real such thing as anonymity in cyberspace. And I think that in 5 or 10 years from now, there isn't going to be any such thing as anonymity in cyberspace. So to some degree, this is going to be almost kind of a moot point. And I think that that's really kind of the larger issue, is whether or not it's even a valid assumption for people to, because the idea that everyone assumed that everything they were doing was not being monitored, and now everyone assumes that everything that they're doing is being monitored. Well, maybe the first set of assumptions was never correct to begin with. And that doesn't necessarily make it legal or make it right, but I think that's kind of the larger conversation that we want to be having is, you know, what would we be willing to give up so that people can browse the internet anonymously? Well, you know, I'm not willing to give up the security of our country. You know, and so I think those are really the things we need to be thinking about. Right here.
If you would provide definitions of what treason, whistleblower, a spy, a traitor, and a defector are for clarification of each one of these nouns.
You might want to do it one at a time.
Okay, what's a defector?
A defector is someone who has specifically given information to another country, who has done it kind of specifically for. Right. So a defector is someone then who has specifically given information to someone from another country.
Yeah. You had some definitions
Yeah, I
at the
have
very
some
beginning,
slides,
yeah.
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Do you
no.
have traitor on there?
I think I do, yeah.
My mistake.
Okay, this isn't advancing. Yeah. Yeah, I'm more than happy to share this with you later. Yeah, is there a mouse, or how does this work?
Well, you can just say what a traitor is.
Yeah, those who furnish information to a foreign government while in the employ of their own government. So this is the distinction then between traitors and someone committing espionage, is that a traitor is someone where the information, like if you gave the information to the media, technically you wouldn't be a traitor because you didn't specifically pass it to the foreign government. But yet you could still be considered to have committed espionage if a foreign government profited from your giving that information.
You know, and I'm sure many of you know, and any attorneys in here, I can stand to be corrected. I am not one, but a traitor is defined in the Constitution
Yes, and
as
it's
doing this,
yes.
and as witnessed by two people. So we're very quick to use the term traitor, but we're loose in the way we use it.
So there is no wartime association with this?
No.
Okay. What is treason?
So treason is specifically someone furnishing information to a foreign government. Although it's interesting, the way it is in the Constitution is there's a big debate now about if you gave the information to a non-state actor. If you gave the information to ISIS or Al-Qaeda, would it still be treason because they're not a foreign government? And I think the actual word in the Constitution is they say something like foreign powers. And there's a debate about who could then be a foreign power. Well, treason's just the act.
Yeah.
And a defector is someone who goes.
Yeah, I was interested in the defector definition because I thought a defector left the country, and maybe I've always misunderstood it.
Well, when you get it, you know, intelligence, like any discipline, has a lot of arcane expressions. You have a defector and then a defector in place.
Yes.
That is, a defector has mentally left his country but is willing to stay in place and work, in our case, for us.
So if you were like a
then you
Cajun,
have
yeah.
people who actually defect but provide information. Often that's the price of their defection.
Yeah.
We have General Kalugan on our board, as many of you know, former chief of counterintelligence in the KGB, ran some of the top operations against our country, Johnny Walker, and a couple of those. He came to this country under a contract with AT&T. It fell through and he stayed on. He never defected. People think he's a defector because of who he is. I did a bus tour once with him, and a lady in the bus, once I explained who he was, she asked me to come over to his seat, and I said yes, and she said, why isn't he in jail? And the point is, he came here, he was very reform-minded, and there was no way he was going to go back. Okay. Mary, you've done a great job. I knew they would be loaded for